Your Excellencies, Your Grace, Very Reverend and Reverend Fathers, dear guests. Welcome to an event to honour the many Australians who helped Serbia in its darkest hours and the memory of our ancestors, part of the centenary of World War I program here in Australia. We are privileged to be joined here today by many descendants of these Australian men and women, including those who fought as allies alongside the Serbian army on the Salonika Front, and those who served as doctors, nurses and other medical volunteers, easing the suffering of many Serbian soldiers and civilians. A number of Australians received royal decorations from Serbia during and after the war, recognising their bravery and gallant and distinguished service. And we have rare examples of some of these medals they received here today. To open the proceedings, we invite you to stand for the national anthems of Serbia and Australia, performed by the St. Lazarus Serbian Orthodox Church Choir. Thank you. Of the Republic of Serbia, His Excellency Mr. Miroljub Petrovic will now address the gathering. Welcome to Serbia Remembers.
I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land where we are meeting on, the Nanawa people, and pay my respect to elders past and present. Senator John Molan, representing the Minister for Veteran Affairs, Your Excellencies, Your Grace Bishop Siluan, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. Let me thank all of you for coming today to share this commemoration of Serbs, Australians and New Zealanders who took part side by side in the Great War. Today we remember the end of the tragic event which befell our countries 100 years ago. At the same time, we remember the self-sacrifice and generosity of spirit which accompanied the tragedy of war. 4 years ago, we marked the beginning of the Great War with a commemoration entitled Serbia in the Great War, Australian Testimonies. On that occasion, we outlined some factual details about the historical connections that exist between Serbia and Australia, which led to further research. Today's commemoration, entitled Serbia Remembers Australians in the World War I, commemorates the assistance which Serbia received from Australians and New Zealanders during the catastrophic period in its national history. For today's commemorative project, I wish to express special thanks to Mrs. Mirjana Đukić from Sydney and Mr. Bojan Pajic from Melbourne for investing considerable time and effort in its preparation. Their personal dedication, which extends to their material and financial support for today's event, has made it possible for us to present at least some of the historical facts which document the help offered to Serbia by many Australians and New Zealanders who are remembered by Serbia with pride and gratitude. The book by Bojan Pajic, Our Forgotten Volunteers, Australians and New Zealanders with Serbs in World War I, will be officially launched here today. Dear guests, in preparing today's commemoration, we sought the most suitable date which would best reflect the events of 100 years ago. We chose the 15th of September as it was precisely on this day in 1918 that the Battle of Dobro Polje began on the Salonika Front, in which the Serbian army with its allies was victorious. This victory marked the beginning of the breakthrough on the Salonika Front and the Serbian army's march back to its native land following 3 years of exile. The progress of Serbian army units and expulsion of the enemy from that day, the 15th of September 1918, was unstoppable. It led to the complete victory over the enemy and the liberation of the country later that year. Dear guests, here I would like to remind us all of a number of important historical facts. First of all, Serbia entered in the Great War in order to survive as a nation. The Great War for Serbia started on the night of the 28th to 29th of July 1914 with attack on Belgrade. This is 1 week earlier in relation to 4th of August, which is recognized as the date of the official outbreak of the Great War and its unstoppable spread over the whole of Europe and the world. Regarding to that, I might add, even if sounds like a bad joke, Serbia is the place where the future often happens first. Dear guests, historians testify to the fact that Serbia achieved the first victory in the Great War. In the famous Battle of Cer, which started on the 15th of August 1914 and ended 2 weeks later with the routing of the enemies and their expulsion from Serbian territory. The worst, however, was to follow. A deadly typhus epidemic and new powerful attack by enemy in October 1915 and the retreat of the Serbian army and civilians of the Albanian mountains, known in Serbian history as the Albanian Golgotha. The recovery of the army and civilians on the Greek island of Corfu, which was facilitated by aid from the Allies, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom, made possible the formation and maintenance of the Salonika Front up to its final breakthrough. Dear guests, the suffering of Serbia in the Great War was enormous. According to the Paris Peace Conference statistics, Serbia lost 28% of its pre-war population. The number of Serbian dead was 1,247,435 persons. This included 845,000 civilians. With such human losses, it's almost superfluous to speak about the heaviest loss of infrastructure and industry and the devastation of natural resources. The hardships endured by the Serbian army and Serbian civilian population on the retreat across Albania and the battle on the Salonika Front were shared by Australians and New Zealanders, New Zealand citizens who came to Serbia together with Serbia aid together with people from other parts of the world. Serbia honored 170 Australians and New Zealanders with Serbian medals of honor. A few years after the Great War, at the request of the Australian government, and the government of Serbia donated a significant collection of the memorabilia, which are now part of the Australian War Memorial Collection and which are displayed today at this commemoration. We hope that in the future these items will become accessible to a wider public. Dear guests, the history of diplomatic relations between Serbia and Australia extends back in time much more than is usually assumed. The first consulate of the Kingdom of Serbia was opened as far back as 1882 in Melbourne, in Little Collins Street. During the Great War, Honorary Consul Arthur Eggleston Oldham collected over £20,000 in aid for Serbia, which is exceptional sum even from today's perspective. As we can see, the history of mutual relations between Serbia and Australia is protracted and rich in testimonies about the closeness of our two nations and peoples. With the memory of our historical ties as a guide, we can map the path of our future mutual relations, cooperation and collaboration. We remember that we were on the same righteous and human side in the struggle to maintain our civilization values, and that this struggle was full of examples of humanity, cooperation, and mutual support. Let me also remember today the proclamation of Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, who decreed that on the 28th of July 1918, on the 4th anniversary of the beginning of the Great War, the Serbian flag should fly from the White House and from all US government buildings. With this rare and symbolic gesture, America paid homage to Serbia's effort and sacrifice in the Great War. In the declaration published on that day, we can read the following, quote, "While their territory has been devastated and their homes despoiled, the spirit of Serbian people has not been broken. Though overwhelmed by superior forces, their love of freedom remains unabated. Brutal force has left unaffected their firm determination to sacrifice everything for liberty and independence." The end of quote. Dear guests, while I stand here before you as the representative of Serbia, I wish to express my deepest gratitude to descendants and relatives of those who were part of the unforgettable history of Serbia, and to thank you in piety and humility for the assistance rendered by your forebears. They were great men and women who proved their mettle at a difficult time when it was necessary. Allow me a few sentences in Serbian. Dragi sunarodnici, današnjom komemoracijom pokazujemo poštovanje i odajemo poštu onim koji su bili sa našim predsima onda kada je to bilo najvažnije i najpotrebnije. Poštujući Australijance i Novozelanđane koji su žrtvovali sebe pomažući Srbiji, poštujemo i naše pretke, ali trasiramo put u budućnost koji treba da bude put saradnje, međusobnog poštovanja i razumevanja. Thank you.
Dear guests, please welcome the Senator for New South Wales, Jim Molan, representing the Minister for Veterans Affairs, Minister for Defence Personnel, and Minister assisting the Prime Minister for the centenary of Anzac.
Ambassador, Your Grace, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's certainly my honour to represent here today the Minister for Veterans Affairs and a number of other things which he is responsible for, the Honourable Darren Chester, at this magnificent and imaginative activity of Serbia Remembers Australians and New Zealanders in World War I. And how inspiring it is to see our magnificent choir over there. What a great cultural and national institution you are, and I thank you very, very much. Thank you. And the other thing that strikes me before I give this fantastic prepared speech that I've got, the other thing that strikes me are these four young men that we have standing in front of us here. And if you look through the books of 1914 on the Macedonian front, you will see exact replicas, exact facially similar people with similar uniforms. And how evocative it really is, because we know that the world is a strange and a dangerous place. We know that sacrifices, as His Excellency spoke about this morning, we know that young men like this of Serbian extraction or Anglo-Saxon extraction, or anyone from our multicultural nation, that we must always remember that weakness of a nation provokes and strength deters. And anything that we in Australia do at a time of increasing uncertainty, strategic uncertainty, if it's one thing that this nation must do with all its peoples, all its background and all its strength, is to be a strong nation, is to be a determined nation. This nation, unlike Serbia and many other countries, has had a magnificent 100 years plus of existence. We're not an old nation, we're a young nation. But what we will do now, and what we will do in the next decade or so, will set this nation up for the next 100 years. I suspect, Ambassador, that one of the reasons why, and Your Grace and Fathers, one of the reasons why you have a community in this country is because this is a magnificent country and your community has contributed greatly to it. We cannot ever assume that this nation will continue for a second 100 years. It's up to us to make it as successful in 100 years' time as we have been so far. So let me return to my prepared speech, ladies and gentlemen. But I believe that the uniforms were only just prepared, came across in the last couple of weeks, and I've got to say the four of you look absolutely magnificent. Great stuff. Thank you very, very much. And the place that we meet today is our hallowed ground in Australia, and it really allows us to reflect not just on the service and sacrifice of Australians in conflict, but also their allies around the world, and Serbia's contribution to the First World War. Important in the context of the wider conflict. And as I understand the history and listening to you, Your Excellency, an Austro-Hungarian ultimatum to Serbia provided the trigger for that appalling conflict between the European nations. Serbia was then rapidly attacked, as the Ambassador reminded us, after the outbreak of war in 1914. The under-equipped military was able to successfully repel the Austro-Hungarian offensive in 1914, twice expelling them from Serbian territory and withstanding a major offensive. Serbia fell in 1915 following a combined offensive from Austro-Hungarian, Bulgarian and German troops, which overwhelmed the courageous Serbian army. It's in this context, really, that Allied support was delivered to the Serbs. While the Australian Imperial Forces themselves did not serve in Serbia or on what was referred to as the Macedonian front, there is still a legacy of Australians assisting Serbian forces during the war, and that's what we're here today to celebrate. Some 450 Australian men and women are believed to have provided medical care to Serbian forces ahead of an Austro-Hungarian offensive in 1916. And we're honoured today to have a great colleague of mine, Major General retired John Pearn, here today with us, with an extraordinary background in medical, extraordinary background in providing service, love and care to those who suffer from war. And thank you very much, John, for being here. In this context, in particular, this is the story I'd like to say today, and I've seen the medals outside there, of Australian nurses serving with valour on the Macedonian front. 3 Australian Army Nursing Service units were posted to Macedonia, serving to assist the wounded Serbian and Allied troops on that front. There seems to be only one known Australian, and John can contradict me later. There seems to be only one unknown Australian who served in the Serbian army. Sergeant Olive May King was in England when the war began and took her own ambulance to Belgium and served in France in 1915. Do we have any descendants of Olive May King here today? I don't think we do we? Oh, is that right? Oh, good on you. Isn't that tremendous? Welcome. I'd love to meet you later if I may. That Sergeant King's hospital was sent to Serbia to help out, but withdrew alongside Serbian forces back to Greece. She then enlisted in the Serbian army as an ambulance driver, driving over debris-strewn roads, sleeping beside her vehicle, and undertaking her own mechanical work when needed. She also established a string of canteens to help displaced Serbian families and soldiers, for which she was awarded the Order of St. Sava, 3rd class, the Obilic Medal for Bravery, the Zealous Conduct Medal, and the Cross of Mercy. Sergeant King's medals, we all saw them as we walked in, are on display outside in the Reg Saunders Gallery today. In remembering the contribution of Sergeant King and Australian nurses, we must reflect on the tragedy that the First World War inflicted on Serbia. As the ambassador reminded us, it's estimated that more than 1 million Serbians died during the war, including the destruction of most of the Serbian army and a terrible typhus epidemic that the ambassador spoke about. This represented almost 1 in 4 people in Serbia, a national disaster the likes of which has rarely been seen throughout history. As we reflect during the preparation for November the 11th, for our preparations, and a century since the guns fell silent across Europe, let's not just consider the contribution and valour of Australians, but of all people impacted by the tragedy of war, including Serbia. Thank you very much.
I would now like to welcome Mr. Bojan Pajic, grandson of a Serbian soldier in World War I and the author of the book Our Forgotten Volunteers, Australians and New Zealanders with Serbs in World War I.
Thank you, Tiana. A few years ago, I started researching the service of my grandfather and great-uncle with the Serbian Army in World War I. But after my friend Richard Cooke, who is here today, told me that his grandmother had served as a nursing sister in Serbia in 1915, I started to search for any other Australians and New Zealanders that may have served in Serbia or alongside the Serbian Army on the so-called Salonika or Macedonian front in 1915-1918. Well, to my continuing surprise, we have to date identified some 1,500 Australian and New Zealanders who were involved. But it is apparent that the service of these men and women were neglected and largely forgotten for a number of reasons which I have outlined in the book about this service, which will be launched later on today. An important component of the project to identify and contact was to contact today's descendants and relatives of these Australians, to learn about their predecessors and also to inform them about the war in Serbia and their forebears that were involved. Today, with the help of the Genealogical Society of Victoria, and in particular Yvonne Isat, who is not here with us today, a volunteer researcher, we have identified over 200 descendants and are in touch with over 120. Of course, many could not come all the way to Canberra today, but 118 relatives of World War I forebears are in the audience today, and I would like to now identify them by naming their forebears from World War I. The name tags you have been given are colour-coded by a dot that will help you identify more easily other relatives of the same group of forebears. So, for example, if they're in the British Army or in the AIF, which served also there, or also with the medical volunteers. The details of the service of each group and many individuals are set out in the book. Australians and New Zealand medical volunteers in Serbia we have in the audience today, in alphabetical order, the relatives of Millie Allender, Blair Donaldson, Ethel Gillingham, and Charles and Laura Hope from Adelaide. Australians who participated in the Battle of Costarino, which was inside Serbia, and the Australians were the following, whose descendants are here today: Bruce McMaster, Niall Mullarkey, Edward Ramage, and Thomas Willis. Members of the Scottish Women's Hospitals and Serbian Relief Fund hospitals in Salonika, Corsica and Serbia: Agnes Bennett, Mary de Garis, Miles Franklin, the author, Edith McKay, and Nell Malone. Australians with British forces on the Salonika Front and hospital ships. We have today here amongst us the descendants of Frank Debenham, Johnston Houston, Francis Looney, Jesse Lowick, and Mervyn Minter, who was a pilot in the British Royal Flying Corps in Salonika. The Navy was also present in the waters of the Adriatic Sea and the Aegean, supporting the Salonika Macedonian or Serbian campaign. And we have today here the descendants of Clarence Bridge, who was a lieutenant in the Royal Australian Navy, Raymond O'Donnell and Reuben Wallace. And we have a photo there of HMAS Parramatta, one of the 6 Australian torpedo boat destroyers who were on service for 2 years there. The Serbian army, we have the descendants today of Frank Darvenica, who volunteered from Australia to join a unit recruited by the Australian Army for the Serbian Army. And we have Olive King, who's already been mentioned, who is the only Australian to actually join the Serbian Army and as an ambulance driver. And my grandfather and great uncle, Lazar Stefanovic and Dragomir Profirovic, who were officers in the Serbian Army in World War I. We also have today the descendants of humanitarian fundraisers and donators who helped Serbia in World War I. And we have here the photos, and we have the descendants here of Kelso King, who's the father of Olive King, and Henry Sutton, an Australian inventor, who incidentally met the Serbian inventor Nikola Tesla, who has become more well known today because of the electric car, but who also donated funds to help Serbia, civilians and soldiers in World War I. During the war and after the war, Serbia and Montenegro decorated Australian medical volunteers, but also Australian soldiers for bravery and for distinguished conduct. Some of the first bravery medals issued after Gallipoli were in fact Serbian medals for bravery. And we have today with us the descendants of some of these Australians that were so decorated. Hubert Alexander, Arthur Baldwin, John Blackman, Joseph Cooper, who in the photo is wearing his Serbian Military Order of Courage in the photo on the extreme right, Randolph Cresswell, John DePeace, James Durant and Percy Reynolds, whose family is here from the famous area of South Australia, the Yorke Peninsula. I have recounted a touching story about Arthur Baldwin and his Serbian medal in the book, which we found by researching the Serbian archives. As my colleagues will shortly speak about their ancestors and the units that they served in Serbia or at the Salonika Front, I will now say a few words about my ancestors and the war in Serbia from a Serbian point of view, in the war that these Australians and New Zealanders forebears played their part in. Serbia mobilised all its able-bodied men as the war started, but my grandfather's regiment, the 20th Infantry Regiment, Timok Division, lacked rifles for 1/3 of the regiment. Soldiers also lacked uniforms, equipment and boots. Critically, Serbia was short of artillery and in particular shells, and relied almost entirely on importing them from its allies, France, Britain, Russia, through the port of Salonika on the Aegean Sea, which is today called Thessaloniki. The Austro-Hungarian armies invaded in August 1914, and the first clashes occurred with local Serbian militia defending their villages, but soon after, Marching after 2 days from central Serbia, demobilised Serbian regiments made contact with the enemy. At Ser Mountain, as has been mentioned, the leading Serbian units encountered Serbian civilians fleeing from atrocities committed by Austro-Hungarian troops. Over 4,000 Serbian civilians were killed by the Austro-Hungarians as soon as they entered Serbia. Over 20,000 civilians were killed later under enemy occupation, 1915 to 1918, and 40,000 Serbian civilians were taken away and put into concentration camps in Austria-Hungary, Germany, and in Bulgaria, many never to return. The first major battle occurred on the 15th, 16th of August at Ser Mountain, after several days of fighting. The Serbian army defeated the Austro-Hungarians and expelled them from Serbia. This was the first Allied victory of the war, preceding that of Mons on the Western Front by a few days. My grandfather and great-uncle were involved in the fighting. One served as a regimental infantry headquarters in it, and the other one was a commander of an infantry company in an infantry battalion. After the initial defeat, the Austro-Hungarians invaded again in September 1914. The Serbian army stopped the invasion with a series of defensive battles along the eastern Serbian side of the river Drina. My great-uncle was wounded in the head and leg at the Battle of Gučevo, but recovered. The Serbian army ran out of artillery shells and was forced to withdraw in October 1914 to the Kolubara River in central Serbia. The Austro-Hungarian army followed and occupied Belgrade for 11 days, but resupplied just in time by the Allies with artillery shells. The Serbian army attacked and defeated the invading Austro-Hungarian army in December 1914 and again expelled the invaders from Serbia. The Serbian army was successful, but at the cost of some 125,000 killed, or about a quarter of the then mobilised army. So they had to remobilise whatever they could for the rest of the war. The Serbs captured some 70,000 POWs, some of whom were sick with typhus. Typhus spread rapidly through the war-torn country during 1915, causing 140,000 deaths. From late 1914, Australians and New Zealanders were serving in Serbia with British voluntary medical units, as we shall hear from Richard. Then in October 1915, Germany decided to invade Serbia, chiefly in order to open a land supply link to Ottoman Turkey, where the Gallipoli campaign was in progress. So the Gallipoli campaign bloodied the Anzacs, but it also sealed the fate of Serbia in late 1915. The campaign thus forms a historical link between Serbia and Australia. The German-led invasion by German and Austro-Hungarian armies was joined a few days later by a pre-arranged invasion by Bulgaria from the east and into the rear of the Serbian armies, fighting the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian invaders in the north. The Serbian army was outgunned and conducted a skillful fighting withdrawal south towards French and British troops sent to the port of Salonika to link up with the Serbian army. Unfortunately, the French and British forces were too little too late to achieve this link with the Serbian rear further north, but Australians with the British 10th Division engaged in a battle in Serbia against Bulgarians in December 1915. Second Lieutenant Ralph Cullen was killed in that battle on the Serbian-Bulgarian border. This action by Australian officers in the British units and an AIF unit of drivers with them is little known. The Serbian army and government, cut off from its allies, were then confronted with a historic decision: seek terms with the enemy or withdraw the king, the government and army from the country and into exile, to fight alongside its allies France, Britain and Russia. The decision was made to withdraw rather than surrender through the so-called accursed mountains of Montenegro and Albania in the middle of winter to the Adriatic seashore and to Allied ships that were waiting for them. Some Australians went on the withdrawal, and an account of their experience is in the book. I have traced the movement of my predecessors' units, my grandfather in blue and my great-uncle in brown. It is quite moving to see where they just walked, let alone that they fought. This was the withdrawal in winter by troops and civilians. It is estimated that the Serbian army lost 270,000 from its ranks and that another 140,000 civilians died during the invasion and withdrawal from the fighting, exposure, famine and exhaustion. Over 150,000 Serbian troops were evacuated from the Albanian Adriatic ports by the Allies, including by the hospital ship Dunluce Castle, on which the aforementioned Dr. Francis Looney and Sister Jessie Lowick served. My grandfather and great-uncle reached Corfu with the Serbian army, and my grandfather stayed in a hospital recovering from typhus. The hospital was a grand villa which you can go and visit today if you go to Corfu, and it was owned by none other by Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. So I know that my Serbian predecessors enjoyed staying at his hospitality. Some 7,700 soldiers died in Corfu from wounds, illness and exhaustion. Many had to be buried at sea in what was called the Blue Grave because they ran out of land to bury them. Fairy Warren from Melbourne and Dr. Mildred Staley from New Zealand were medical staff on Corfu serving with the Serbian Relief Hospital. After recovery, the Serbian army was transferred from Corfu to Salonika, where it immediately went into action against the Bulgarian and Germans who were holding the front there. It won the major battles with the allies of France and Britain, the battles of Gorničevo, Kajmakčalan, and liberated the then Serbian town of Monastir, now called Bitola, in Macedonia in late 1916. There, the Scottish Women's Hospital, so-called America Unit, commanded by Australian women doctors, Agnes Bennett and then Mary de Garris, whose descendants are here today, and where Myers Franklin, whose descendants are here today, wrote about her experiences in a most amusing way, was put in support of the Serbian army in the immediate rear of the front lines. Here is the photo we see Dr. Agnes Bennett showing the Serbian Crown Prince Alexander the hospital near Lake Ostrovo. Some 380 Australian Army nurses arrived in Salonika in 1917, as did 6 Australian torpedo boat destroyers with about 400 crew, including Lieutenant Bridges, Able Seaman O'Donnell and Wallace that we mentioned. Also, a unit of volunteers from Australia came to join the Serbian army, which included Frank Darvenica from Queensland, whose descendants are here today. Trench warfare continued on the Salonika front from that September 1915, and 100 years ago the Serbian army led an offensive by Allied French, British and Greek troops that broke through the Bulgarian and German lines and in a rapid campaign liberated Serbia from enemy occupation. Some Australians and New Zealanders followed the advancing Serbian army back into Serbia, such as Agnes Kerr, Olive King, Edith Mackay and Nell Malone. The breakthrough caused Bulgaria to sue for peace, which was then followed by Ottoman Turkey and Austria-Hungary. Germany, exhausted on the Western Front, but still with its army intact on French soil, decided it could not fill the breach opened by the collapse of Bulgaria and Austria-Hungary, and to defend against an Allied attack from liberated Serbia into Austria and southern Germany. It agreed to the armistice, and that ended World War I. But the neglected Serbian and Salonika front and 1,500 largely forgotten Australian and New Zealanders that served there are the ones that we remember today and that we think and know contributed significantly to that victory. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce my friend Richard Cooke, who is the grandson of a nursing sister who served in Serbia in 1915. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Bojan, and good afternoon, everybody, or should I say, dobar dan. In 1914-15, 24 Australians, mostly women, set forth as medical volunteers to Serbia. One of these Australians was my grandmother, Ethel Gillingham, and it's my privilege to share a little of her experiences and impressions whilst in Serbia. Ethel, who was in England at the outbreak of war, would have noticed a rising public interest in Serbia. Serbia had become a British ally and was patriotic to support Serbia against the big bully Austria. In circumstances of stalemate on the Western Front, Serbia presented a positive story in that it twice, and some historians now argue 3 times, defeated Austrian invasions in 1914. And support for Serbia was fashionable. Serbia was championed by sections of the British aristocracy, the intelligentsia, and newspapers of the day. The Anglican Church celebrated Kosovo Day, and school curricula was changed to include things Serbian. So, when the Serbian Red Cross launched an international appeal for medical assistance following the outbreak of a typhus epidemic in the winter of 1914-15, England, along with other countries, rallied. Medical teams were formed and headed off to Serbia. Some of these groups included feminist, female doctors unable to serve with their male colleagues in the British Army. Exploits of the missions in Serbia were trumpeted by the British press, and the women volunteers depicted as heroines, risking their lives to rescue Serbs from disease or death in a remote corner of Europe, all of which added to the popularity of the Serbian cause. The British medical teams were expecting to deal with the typhus epidemic, as well as to treat war injuries. The typhus outbreak had come from captured Austrian soldiers and quickly spread into the general population. In war-ravaged and malnourished Serbia, typhus mortality rates were as high as 70%. Typhus was spread by lice, but this mechanism was unknown in Serbia. Symptoms included fever, high temperature, rash, vomiting, headache, and agonising stomach and back pain. There was no treatment for typhus, only prevention. As part of prevention, Australian volunteers washed and shaved Serbian soldiers and civilians and fumigated their clothes with steam or sulphur. The medical volunteers were at risk of contracting typhus, and some British volunteers did and died. The Australian volunteers performed surgery and treated other diseases too. Generally, accounts from the time paint a picture of overwhelming patient numbers, high mortality, limited resources, and exhausting hours. The accounts also depict the Serbians as grateful, uncomplaining, and endearing. My grandmother, Ethel Gillingham, arrived in Vanaška Banja, central Serbia, in May 1915 to join the 2nd British Red Cross unit stationed there. Ethel, aged 31, born in Geelong, had done nursing training in Colac and Wangaratta. Like many volunteers, she had sailed across the Mediterranean Sea with Sir Thomas Lipton, the famous tea merchant and supporter of the Serbian cause. Vanaška Banja, an old spa town with roomy guest houses, was ideally suited for medical care. As the summer arrived, the typhus outbreak began to contain, and the British missions offered general medical treatment to the local community. In October 1915, the 4th invasion of Serbia occurred, this time with German, Austrian and Bulgarian armies. Reflecting later, Ethel wrote, "Soldiers who had fought bravely and had borne their wounds and defeat so cheerfully, wept like children as they thanked us and bade us goodbye. It seems to me that never will the mental picture of those bullock carts going slowly down the hill, bearing away our poor wounded Serbs, fade from my memory. We shut our eyes or assisted Serb soldiers who were equal to it to escape. Poor fellows, if they managed to escape the search, which the Austrians afterwards made of the surrounding hills, they must have died of their wounds, which were all more or less septic, or of exposure. I really worked hard during those first weeks of the invasion, and my eyes were seldom dry. Poor little Serbia, how my heart aches for her and her brave people. On the 10th of November 1915, the Austrians entered Vanashkabanya. Ethel commented, "We lived very carefully in those days. Not only the Serbian but Austrian soldiers were almost starved. The civilians suffered even more. One sour black loaf for 8 persons was a daily allowance." Ethel's food ration was a mug of beans twice a day, cooked in fat, but she had trouble digesting this and was to lose half her body weight in the next 4 months. Cold was also a problem. Ethel said, "During November and December, when the cold was at its worst, wood was very precious, and our rooms were like freezing chambers. For one period, the nurses' blankets were confiscated. It was minus 23 degrees, and they were prevented from getting firewood." After 4 months, the American Red Cross negotiated the unit's repatriation to England. At the Austrian border with Switzerland, Ethel hid the unit's remaining gold sovereigns in thermoses, covering them with wax and coffee. This incident was reported in the West Gippsland Gazette a year later with comment, "A woman with initiative like this has heaps more claim on military command than creatures like the German Crown Prince." I never knew my grandmother, but I grew up with stories about her experiences in Serbia from my mother. In 2009, I visited Vanashkabanya, the place my mother had mentioned so much in relation to Ethel. There I was proud to read a memorial erected in 1985 that said, "In memory of the humanity of the British women, doctors and nurses who treated Serbian soldiers and the people of Vanashkabanya in the hospitals here in 1915. My exploration of the context of my grandmother's life was stimulated by a chance meeting with Bojan Pajic in 2010. Today's event is all due to him and the team he gathered. Thank you, Bojan, and thank you, team.
We are privileged to have with us Major General Professor John Pearn from the School of Medicine, University of Queensland, to deliver the principal address of today's event, The Oak and the Wattle, Australians with Serbs in World War I. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor John Pearn.
Your Excellency, Mr. Miro Petrovic and Dr. Petrovic, the Honourable Senator General Jim Molan, Mr. Bojan Pajic and Robin, members of the Senior Diplomatic Corps, our colleagues from throughout Australia, from so many places in Australia, who proudly identify with Serbian heritage, which we acknowledge so humbly today. On this centenary occasion, we come together to acknowledge the courage and the service of those who've served in one of the most tragic conflicts in history, and to acknowledge the role played by Australians in one part of that terrible war on the Eastern Front. Today in Australia, the wattle blooms in the spring outside where we meet in this special place. And today in Serbia, the national tree, the oak, stands tall and enduring, as do its citizens. Australians were enjoined also with Serbian colleagues in those campaigns of 100 years ago, in Serbia itself, in evacuation hospitals elsewhere, on Royal Australian Navy ships in the Adriatic and in the Mediterranean, and through humanitarian aid and their services in many places. More than 1,500 Australians and New Zealanders have been identified by our wonderful scholars who've put together this program today. 1,500 Australian and New Zealanders who served in Serbia in World War I. This number included more than 170 Australian soldiers serving in British forces on the Salonika Front, together with more than 32 Australian doctors and nurses and more than 100 AIF soldiers who served in Serbia itself. Some Australians served as volunteers in the Serbian army, including, as we've heard, one unique Australian woman ambulance driver with descendants here today who joined herself the Serbian army. In 1917 and in 1918, Serbia acknowledged the service of those Australian men and women who volunteered and travelled across the world, almost all of them at their own expense, and who served under conditions, as we've seen and heard, of appalling hardship. Some 141 of those Australians were decorated with one or more of the 9 Serbian orders of chivalry. When war broke out, in August 1914, the Balkan region remained one of great political, military and of social unrest. The two Balkan wars of 1912 and 1913 had driven out the Ottomans, but had not established stability. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire was expanding by aggression, as was Germany to the west. The Bulgars to the east remained belligerent, but the Western nations, particularly the United Kingdom, France, and indeed Germany also, had major commercial interests, or these nations coveted interests, in the huge oil reserves in Persia, particularly here to the east in northern Mesopotamia. It was an era when ships were changing from coal-fired motive power to oil-fired burning, and free access through the Dardanelles to the Black Sea was regarded as a trade route of crucial importance. And after war was declared, of course, in August 1914, finally, Turkey sided with the Axis powers and potentially blocked Western access to those oil fields in the Middle East. As we all know, on 28th of June 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was the catalyst of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy to declare war against Serbia, and thus the consequential catalyst for the outbreak of World War I. Over the ensuing 2 years, there was massive loss of life in Serbia, and just in the first few months, these statistics show the endurance of those in that deadly outbreak of war. As we've heard, the massive typhus epidemic of those first 9 months of the war killed more than 140,000 soldiers and civilians. And very sadly, more than 40,000 school-age boys and young teenagers who had followed the Serbian army, boys 5 and 10 years younger than our wonderful representative standing before us here today, also died, some 36,000 of them from hunger and exposure. These awful statistics of war mask the individual human stories of what every soldier knows. And here is a picture of one of those boys following the army, cradled with protection against the cold and exposure by a Serbian soldier in that awful campaign, fighting in sub-zero conditions without adequate equipment, food or shelter. Every soldier, such as this, knows the personal conflicting emotions, courage yet fear, exhilaration yet pain, triumphant moments, yet ones of great and profound depression, pride, sometimes combined with guilt, and adventure, sometimes combined with passivity and a feeling of helplessness. These statistics of war belie the individual stories of courage and service and of sacrifice. In late 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, Australia was essentially an Anglo-Saxon society, and census figures of the day showed in the total population of Australia, which was 4.4 million in 1914, that this was the makeup of the Australian population. But within those figures, we know that there were subgroups, and we know that many individuals who on the census forms identified themselves as Australian-born, or of UK-born and New Zealand-born, of course, proudly at that stage were of Serbian ancestry. In spite of these ethnic or cultural backgrounds, Australians, both individually and certainly collectively as a nation, had demonstrated even before Federation the characteristic of responding with courage to reports of aggression or atrocities elsewhere. On the Western Front, for example, when Germany invaded Belgium in 1914, there was a spontaneous outpouring of civilian revulsion and then support, and our federal government immediately contributed £1 million to the Belgian Relief Fund. And as news of the suffering on this Eastern Front became widespread, there was a huge response by Australian civilians contributing voluntary subscriptions for the relief and suffering consequent upon the war. More than a dozen patriotic funds were established in Australia by voluntary subscription, as we can see here. And when we have a look at the relative contribution of Australians identifying with Serbian and Belgian ancestry, one can see the disproportionate outpouring of support by Serbian Australians to the relief of their compatriots across the world. In addition to this pragmatic financial response, there was a call to arms, not only by older adolescents and men enlisting in the AIF, but a desire on the part of many professional women to serve on active service on operational deployment. Now, women doctors, for example, were denied the privilege of serving in the Australian Defence Force in that era. In fact, women doctors were not commissioned in the Australian Army Medical Corps until 1940, and then only with honorary rank. And in the British Army, it was not until 1962 that women doctors were given permanent commissions in the British Army. In 1914, to enable women to serve on operational service in extended medical and healthcare roles, a visionary Tasmanian, hearing of these dreadful circumstances, an Indian-born Tasmanian young woman, later working in New Zealand, went and a suffragette, graduated in medicine as a standard bearer for the rights of women's access to the professional disciplines, particularly those of medicine. She was Dr. Elsie Maud Inglis, and in 1914, at the outbreak of war, she was the honorary secretary of the Scottish Federation of Women's Suffragette Societies, based in Edinburgh. With fellow suffragettes and other women of wisdom, the Scottish Women's Hospitals contributed very significantly to the Allied war effort. In 1918, there were 14 fully equipped hospitals. This is the cover of the official history of the Scottish Women's Hospitals. And the Latin reads, as you can see there, directly, don't treat me with impunity. If you do, you will be punished. In colloquial terms, these women, fiercely suffragettes, defending their rights, that motto is translated as, don't mess with me. One of these 14 hospitals, funded by voluntary philanthropy, particularly from the United States of America, was called the American Unit. And exactly 100 years after that unit was formed, Serbia issued these wonderful postage stamps honouring Dr. Inglis and many of the other women who served in Serbia on that occasion. And after the war, the wonderful Serbian sculptor Ivan Mitrovic donated this beautiful sculpture of Dr. Inglis for her service in Serbia from Australia and New Zealand. And it stands today in the Edinburgh Art Gallery in a place of great honour. And it's a place where many of us, when seeing that, reflect on the service of all those volunteers who went to the aid of Serbia now 100 years ago. Australian doctors and nurses who served in Serbia served in many different appointments, as we can see here. The American unit, which served in Serbia, initially at Salonika, was linked with the 3rd Serbian Army. And the unit comprised all women, of course, 60 women, 5 doctors, 20 nurses, 14 dressers, 10 orderlies, ambulance drivers, cooks and others. Some of those are represented in their successors who are here today. And this is one, I've just chosen one of those hundreds of women who served with the Scottish Women's Hospitals throughout many parts of Europe, and particularly on the Eastern Front. Let me briefly tell you the story of but 2 Australian women who served, whose lives are in some ways cognate with that of my own. They were Lillian Violet Cooper, surgeon and paediatrician of my own hospital in Brisbane, and her lifelong partner, Miss Mary Josephine Bedford. I was privileged to edit and publish this account of their lives, written by my late colleague, Professor Leslie Williams. Lillian Violet Cooper was born in Chatham in Kent, the daughter of a captain in the Royal Marine Light Infantry. But as was the custom of middle-class girls in those days, she was born in 1861, she was taught at home by a governess, and her education was directed towards learning the accomplishments needed to establish a happy and a successful home. And in her late years, she met a visiting girl of her own age who was visiting in her own town, Mary Bedford, who was the daughter of the canon of Rochester Cathedral. And these two remained devoted, lifelong companions. Both Lillian Violet Cooper and Miss Mary Josephine Bedford both manifested great resolve and independence. And Lillian Violet Cooper, against the patterns of her time, in 1890 studied for and graduated from the London School of Medicine for Women. And she then passed the examinations for the licentiate of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of both Edinburgh and Glasgow. Lillian Violet Cooper and Mary Bedford, these two, emigrated to Brisbane, arriving on the 29th of May 1891. And Dr. Cooper established her medical practice at the Mansions in George Street in what today is central Brisbane. In 1896, she was appointed as the outpatient physician to the Hospital for Sick Children, my own hospital in Brisbane. But proudly, that appointment was the first woman doctor ever to be appointed to an appointment to a public hospital in Australia. Such was the prejudice against women serving in those roles in that era. But she was a skilled surgeon and a generalist and a wonderful paediatrician. In 1914, she applied to serve in the First World War as a military surgeon, but she was rejected, of course, for military service. And she, together with her partner, Miss Bedford, travelled to London, and they enlisted with that Scottish Women's Hospital, and they were posted to the American unit on the Eastern Front. They arrived in Salonika on the 13th of August 1916, and on the 5th of September 1916, the Serbian Director of Medical Services sent them on to Ostrovo, 90 kilometres from Salonika. This is Miss Bedford here at the time when she went to Serbia. And here they are together. They were an item, as they say, in Brisbane. Dr. Cooper here and Miss Bedford here. They lived together in central Brisbane, were often seen in these traps. And it was this pair reading about the atrocities and then the subsequent plight of the Allies in Serbia, enlisted and joined the Women's Hospital and then went to serve overseas. So this is Ostrovo, and these are some photographs from Lillian Violet Cooper's own photographic record of the day. The hospital there was a well-equipped one. It was 200 beds, a tented hospital with an operating theatre and one of the new X-ray units. X-rays had only been discovered exactly 19 years before this time. And the X-ray units consisted of a massive series of batteries in series charging up those primitive X-ray machines. But there was a pathology laboratory there, crucially important, as we've heard, because of the tragedies of the massive typhus epidemic that struck Serbia at that time. At this post, Dr. Cooper performed thousands of wound dressings and attention to the sick and injured. She performed, under these circumstances, 144 surgical operations, many of them amputations. Only 16 of her patients died, an astounding positive statistic in an era prior not only to the discovery of antibiotics much later in 1940, but this was also 17 years before the discovery of the first of the chemotherapeutic agents, the sulfonamides. In 1916, Dr. Cooper and Miss Bedford were posted to establish a forward dressing station in parallel with other dressing stations manifested by under the Serbian army itself. This is a cachelet, one of the methods of transportation, and the chain of evacuation involved a wounded soldier being transported by this means, or on the back, or on a handheld stretcher, to the forward dressing station, where Lillian Violet Cooper, and I use her example as that of many scores of other Australian women who served under those advanced dressing stations. And it was there that they did the first life-saving surgery, and it was there that Miss Bedford, Dr. Cooper's companion, who was head of the 12 ambulance unit based there as well, would take them back then for further definitive care further in the rear. This is the terrain under which those forward evacuations of wounded Serbs were taken, and they were brought by hand over this incredible terrain to those forward dressing stations where they received their first care. Such as this, one can see under tents this primitive life-saving attention which was first given. And this very human photo shows Dr. Cooper with Miss Bedford cleaning their shoes outside their domestic tent where they lived at Ostrovo. They were then directed by the Serbian medical force to go to further afield to establish a new forward dressing station at Dobrovino, which is shown here, where they established another 40-bed surgical unit. And in April 1917, the couple were again posted to establish a further frontline dressing station very close now to the front line at Skosovir on the Zerna River. And this is a picture of that dressing station. Again, just a very candid handheld shot of Dr. Cooper and Miss Bedford. And here is the hospital on the Zerna River, as we can see there. One can see the appalling terrain under which the surviving wounded would be brought for care there. Well, their legacy, of course, is in the written records, in the research conducted by Bojan and other medical and military historians today, in some monuments, but very much in the spirit of this centenary acknowledgement of their service, in which we're all privileged to be enjoined today. Lillian Violet Cooper and Miss Bedford were both awarded the Order of St Sava, and this is Lillian Violet Cooper's decoration, now held in the Anglican Church of St Mary's as one of the proud artefacts of that service in Brisbane. So, colleagues, to conclude, at this time, when in one sense we celebrate the end of one of the most tragic wars in history, we reflect on those events on that Eastern Front. Wise societies today learn from history, and an acknowledgement of the causes and the consequences of those Serbian campaigns hopefully will lead enlightened societies of today to continue our efforts to ensure a more enlightened future and perhaps a better world. Thank you all.
St. Lazarus Serbian Orthodox Church Choir will now sing Kreće se lađa Francuska, The French Ship is Setting Sail, a poem by Colonel Branislav Miloslavljevic, first sung in Salonika harbour in 1916, where the Serbian army was recuperating after the tragic withdrawal through the Albanian mountains.
More je plavo široko, široko plavo duboko, nigde mu kraja videti, ne mogu misli podneti, nigde mu kraja videti, ne mogu misli podneti, kreće se lađa Francuska, sa pristaništa Solunska, transport se kreće Srbadi, ratnici braća ranjeni, transport se kreće Srbadi, ratnici braća ranjeni, putujem tužan žalostan, pomislim Bože nisam sam, i moja braća putuju, da sa mnom zajedno tuguju, i moja braća putuju, da sa mnom zajedno tuguju.
Please welcome one of the main participants in the project Serbia Remembers, Australians and New Zealanders in World War I, Mrs. Margaret Brown, grandniece of Lieutenant Niall Mullarkey, who fought in Serbia in 1915.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here this afternoon to talk about my great-uncle, Niall Joseph Mullarkey, as well as other Australians who fought in Serbia and Salonika during the First World War. When I first found out that my great-uncle had fought in Serbia, I thought for sure he must have been the only Australian there. How wrong was I? As we've heard, there in fact were hundreds of Australians who fought and served in Serbia and Salonika during the First World War. These included at least 134 Australian men attached to British units as soldiers, doctors and pilots. Another 52 men from the 22nd and the 24th Battalions of the Australian Imperial Force were there in 1916 for a couple of months. They were supported by an Australian veterinary officer and his personal batman. Another 61 Australian men from the Australian Remount arrived in 1916. there were 6 Australian torpedo-class destroyers patrolling the Mediterranean and the Adriatic seas, as well as over 300 Australian nurses from the Australian Army Nursing Corps who arrived in 1917. Now, some of these men were already overseas when war broke out, and they were travelling or studying and enlisted in England. Some of the doctors responded to an appeal from Lord Kitchener, the British Secretary of War, and joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. Others, like my great-uncle, were already in the Australian Army and transferred across to British units when they received imperial commissions in the British Army. My great-uncle, Niall, was born in 1895 in Rockdale, a suburb of Sydney in New South Wales. He was in his first year studying veterinary science at Sydney University when war broke out. He enlisted immediately in August of 1914 as a private in the 1st Battalion, Australian Imperial Force, and with them was sent to Egypt with the 1st contingent. At the time, he told his brother that the reason why he enlisted was that he got caught up in the excitement, the enthusiasm and the spirit of adventure. Once Niall got to Egypt, he was selected for officer training and became a 2nd lieutenant. He was attached to the 7th Battalion, Royal Munster Fusiliers, 30th Brigade, 10th Irish Division, one of the divisions raised in Ireland for Lord Kitchener's new British Army. Niall joined his battalion in Gallipoli for a short period of time before proceeding on to Salonika, arriving in early October 1915. Now, the Irish 10th Division and the French 156th Division had been sent into Serbia to support the Serbian army, who were trying to push the Bulgarians out of the north of Serbia. When Niall arrived, the French had already proceeded north, and they were positioned along the Vardar Valley. By November, Niall and his battalion were situated on the Costarino Ridge, which ran from the village of Costarino southeast to Lake Dorian near the Greek border. Now, holding this ridge was important because it prevented the Bulgarians from cutting off the withdrawal of the French army, who still were located further north into Serbia. But conditions on the ridge were challenging. It was rocky and steep. There were deep ravines. The soil was shallow and unsuitable for digging deep trenches. The vegetation was sparse and scrubby, none of which offered any great protection from the artillery and the machine gun fire from the nearby mountain positions occupied by the Bulgarians. British artillery support was limited, and communication was often difficult and unreliable. And then, to make matters worse, the weather changed, and Niall wrote to his family that a snowstorm set in, and men were ill-prepared in their light summer kit. Many froze at their positions, and many had to be evacuated, suffering frostbite and frozen limbs. When the weather cleared, the Bulgarians took the initiative, and they began a continuous artillery barrage. On December the 6th, they attacked and succeeded in gaining a stronghold on Rocky Peak, a strategically important position less than a kilometre forward of where the British were located. Although they were pushed back, it was during this fighting that 2nd Lieutenant Ralph Neville Cullen, an Australian fighting with the Royal Irish Fusiliers, was killed. The very next day, the Bulgarians attacked again, this time in overwhelming numbers, and Niall, as a machine gun officer, was in the thick of the fighting. The British decided to retire from the ridge, and Niall and his battalion were one of the last to leave in the withdrawal back to Greece. By the 20th of December, the British and the French armies were back in Salonika, and Niall wrote to his family that he never wished to go through such a horrible time again. He was 20 years of age. The British remained in Salonika for the rest of the war, and the Australians there remained with their units and continued fighting into 1916 and then right up until 1918. When Niall first arrived in Salonika in October of 1915, another group of Australians arrived at the same time to support the British Army. These were the drivers of the 22nd and the 24th Battalions, part of the 6th Brigade Australian Imperial Force. These drivers had been on their way to Gallipoli and were diverted to Salonika. Men such as Francis Greenway, Edward Ramage and mates Thomas Willis and Robert Wigger were among the 51 men under the command of Captain William Merriman True of the 24th Battalion. Now, when they arrived, their duty, took the donkeys, the horses and the mules up into the mountains with the supplies. They were also in charge of looking after the wounded, evacuating the wounded, guarding the prisoners and the general care of the animals. In this, they were assisted by an Australian veterinary officer, Captain Arthur Dowling, and his batman, Farrier Arthur Wyndham of the 12th Australian Light Horse. When the armies retreated back to Salonika in December of 1915, all these Australians then returned to their original units in Egypt. But 12 months later, in August of 1916, another 60 Australians arrived under the command of Captain James Boy from the Australian Remount. They arrived with a shipload of 600 mules. And although they were only in Salonika for about a week, it was the first time that any men from this unit had ever been sent overseas from Egypt with a shipload of the animals. In July and August of 1917, 300 Australian nurses arrived from the Australian Army Nursing Corps for service in British hospitals at places such as Hortiac and Calamaria. They were under the supervision of Principal Matron Jessie McHardy White, and they remained in the Balkans until the end of the war in 1918. There were also at least 40 Australian doctors attached to the Royal Army Medical Corps, doctors such as Johnston Eugston and Dr. Looney. Dr. Mark Gardner and Thomas Benbow Palmer were with the British Red Cross. Dr. James Donaldson was serving in a French hospital in Serbia, and Dr. John Leaney was with the New Zealanders. Now, all of these doctors and nurses and soldiers suffered through the cold, wet winters and the hot malarian-borne summers. Many became sick and had to be evacuated, and one of the nurses, Sister Gertrude Munro, died in October of 1918 from the effects of malaria. In fact, among the Australians who died in Serbia and Salonika were also 2 Australian pilots attached to the Royal Flying Corps. In March of 1917, 2nd Lieutenant Donald Glasson was shot down north of Salonika by a German aircraft, and then in June of 1918, Lieutenant Edmund Rennie was killed when his aircraft went into a spiral from about 300 feet and crashed to earth. There were also 6 Australian torpedo-class destroyers patrolling the Mediterranean and the Adriatic Seas: HMAS Ewan, Parramatta, Yarra, Torrens, Swan and Warrago, with sailors such as Raymond O'Donnell, Reuben Wallace, Clarence Bridge, and Reginald Farmer. Their duties included monitoring shipping and submarine activity, as well as supplying ports such as Salonika with men and supplies. In fact, at one time, there were so many Australians in Salonika that old schoolmates were running into each other. Captain Jack Manning of the Royal Irish Fusiliers wrote home to his family in Sydney that he'd run into an old schoolmate from Sydney Grammar School, Captain Arthur Dowling, who was the vet. Now, some of these men and women served in other areas, such as France and England, Egypt and Palestine, and many returned safely home at the end of the war. But unfortunately, many did not, including my great-uncle, Niall Joseph Mullarkey. Towards the end of 1916, he'd requested a transfer back to his original unit, the 1st Battalion, Australian Imperial Force. He joined them in France in October of 1916. And 1 month later, on the 5th of November, he was killed, leading his men in a futile night attack near Fleurs in France. Niall was 21 years of age and his body has never been recovered. In our family, my mother, Nyla, was named after him. My youngest son, David, has Niall as his second name. And coincidentally, my eldest son Matthew is studying veterinary science at Melbourne University. His legacy and his memory continues on to this day. And like all of these men and women, their service and their sacrifice is and never will be forgotten. Thank you.
It is our great honour to introduce His Grace, the Right Reverend Bishop Siluan of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Australia and New Zealand. The St. Lazarus Serbian Orthodox Church in Sydney and her Library Fund is one of the main organisers of this event with the blessings and support of His Grace. Ladies and gentlemen, the Serbian people in World War I and His Grace Bishop Siluan.
Your Excellencies, very Reverend Fathers, distinguished guests, dear friends, dear brothers and sisters. It is wonderful to be here today in common union, to be able to commemorate and appreciate in one chorus the great sacrifices and legacy handed down to us by those who gave the ultimate sacrifice for family, neighbour, friend and country. I have been entrusted this afternoon to say a few words about the Serbian people within the context of World War I, about their character and person, about their inner spirit and phronema. To achieve this goal, I decided to look into the Serbian people's inner sanctum through the eyes of those who bled in order that others may live, the Serbian soldier of the day. Historical records and oral testimonies point to the Serbian soldier of the Great War being a symbol of all that is beautiful about the Serbian people and their spirit. It was his example, his virtues, as one academic put it, that would lead the Serbian people in moments of heightened spiritual sojourn and prayer to search for the face of the ordinary soldier. One commentary on the character of the Serbian soldier of World War I that has survived from that period illustrates the following. The Serbian peasant soldier is calm, quiet, full of goodness, of good temperance, full of love. He is, however, the same soldier who will not surrender his fields, his roads, his house, and his family. He is the proud hero who will not surrender his faith and fatherland. When someone tries to take this away from him, the peaceful peasant becomes an uncompromising fighter for truth and righteousness. His person begins to manifest other, until then less noticeable virtues. All his gallantry and unyieldingness and determination that comes to the fore in its full vividness, at the same time upholding the dignity and goodness reflected in his honour and humanism as opposed to his enemy. The Serbian people in World War I were conscious of their national identity and how important it was for them to restore their sovereignty as a nation. They had just come out of 500 years of Ottoman oppression and 2 successive Balkan wars, working on restoring their country, but found themselves once again faced with potential loss of liberty and oppression when the Austro-Hungarian forces declared war on them. It would be the same peasant soldier who would push back the mighty Austro-Hungarian aggressor out of Serbia. The bravery shown by this small kingdom moved many intellectuals and military strategists of the time to comment on the spirit and character of the Serbian soldier, that is, the Serbian people. One observation for me as a man of faith particularly caught my attention. Commenting on the Serbian army's achievements in the Great War, French professor at Sorbonne University, Emil Oman, pointed to the Serbian faith as being the source of this energy. It is my firm conviction that the professor spoke profound truth in terms of the resilience and strength of the Serbian spirit, the spirit of the Serbian people. The love of nation was always perceived through the lens of the gospel of Christ, which always saw the laying down of one's own life for fellow neighbour, for the weak and innocent, as a Christian duty, an honourable martyrdom. This legacy has been intrinsically a part of the Serbian Front since the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. It has become Serbia's gospel, the Gospel of Kosovo, which is none other than the Gospel of Christ. The striving for the eternally important, the eternally right and beautiful, a struggle for the perpetual values in life that have upheld and shaped society. This was the strength of the Serbian people, what kept the Serbian spirit alive and unbreakable for so many generations under Ottoman rule. It was this spirit that gave the Serbian people strength and vision and altruistic sensitivity, paradoxical for many, to exhibit love and compassion towards the enemy, an enemy that had just barbarically slaughtered its people. There are many acts of kindness that have been recorded during the Great War, enacted by Serbian officers and infantry towards the enemy forces. I would like to share one particular story with you that illustrates the character and the ethic of the Serbian people in World War I. The story goes as follows. After breaking through the Salonika Front, a wounded Serbian soldier who had no means of being escorted to the field hospitals behind the front line was given a horse with which he was to make his own way back to the hospital to be treated. On his way back, he stumbled upon a Bulgarian soldier who, having noticed the Serb, surrendered immediately. The Bulgarian soldier was completely exhausted and was too weak to walk. The wounded Serbian soldier, seeing this, dismounted his horse and helped the Bulgarian soldier mount the horse. He took the reins and began leading him to the hospital he was to be treated at. As he was moving towards the hospital, he came across a group of Serbian officers. One of the officers, seeing the wounded soldier on foot escorting the enemy on horseback, asked him why he had the Bulgarian soldier up on the horse and himself wounded on foot. He responded by saying, "My wounds are not serious enough to hinder me from walking, but this man is too weak to walk, so I put him on the horse. Just yesterday we were enemies, and today he has surrendered, so he is no longer the enemy. He's a prisoner, and I'm obliged to look after his well-being." I will dare to say that this example mirrors the biblical parable of the Good Samaritan. There are many similar stories that have been recorded from this period. We've also heard some of those affirmations today of the same character from our beloved Australians and New Zealanders who were with the Serbs at the Salonika Front. In closing, I would like to point out that in this ugly war, when humanity seemed all but lost, the love, compassion and self-giving manifested in the example of the Serbian soldier and the actions of our beloved Anzacs, whom we remember today, demonstrate the inner goodness of humanity as the bearer of the image and likeness of a loving God. As Bishop of the Serbian Orthodox faithful in Australia and New Zealand, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank all the brave men and women who left these shores to help the Serbian people during their hour of need, their struggle for freedom and a right to human dignity. In doing so, they fulfilled the greatest commandment, or service of love towards one's neighbour, a selfless love which St. Paul spoke of to the Corinthians. May the Lord grant them eternal rest and his heavenly kingdom. At the same time, I would like to acknowledge and thank the many descendants of our brave Anzacs who are present here today for affirming the legacy of your forebearers, the legacy of compassion and love towards the Serbian people. The Serbian people, your friends, are so ever grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Grace. We are honoured to have here today Mrs. Kathy Hancock, grandniece of Dr. Mary de Garis, Chief Medical Officer of a volunteer hospital in support of the Serbian Army from 1916 to 1918. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good afternoon. Mary de Garris, my great-aunt, was a feminist before it was fashionable. Education was non-negotiable for the females in her family, and it was this sort of broad thinking in the late 1800s that set the course of Mary's life. Before I continue, I would like to acknowledge Dr. Ruth Lee from Deakin University. Ruth wrote her PhD on Mary, as well as writing her biography titled Woman War Doctor. And Ruth probably knows more about my great-aunt than I do. Mary graduated in medicine in 1905 from Melbourne Uni. The medical world at this time could be described as a boys' club. After graduating, she was unsuccessful in establishing her medical rooms in Melbourne, so she was forced to go much further afield. She set up practice in Tibooburra in far western New South Wales. While there, she met and became engaged to Colin Thompson from nearby Mount Stewart Station. Colin enlisted in the Australian Army in 1915. Mary applied to enlist in the Australian Army as a doctor but was refused. The Army at that time did not accept women other than nurses, masseurs and ward assistants. So, nonetheless, she sailed to the UK in June 1916. Colin survived Gallipoli, but was killed in action at Pozieres on the Western Front on the 4th of August 1916. His last postcard to Mary was written on that same day. He wrote, "I don't know when I will see you. Soon, I hope. We charge tonight and are confident of success. Goodbye for the time." Mary received news of Colin's death while alone in Mary, and found amongst his possessions was a photograph of Mary. So Colin's death strengthened Mary's desire to become involved in the war effort. She joined the Scottish Women's Hospitals, a feminist organisation founded by Dr. Elsie Inglis. Its aim was to support the British Army with trained female staff. The Army, however, declined their offer, telling Dr. Inglis to go home and sit still. But the Allied armies of Russia, France, Belgium and Serbia accepted their services. Mary became a surgeon in Ostrovo in northern Macedonia under the Serbian army on the Balkan front from February 1917 to October 1918. She treated mainly Serbian soldiers, but also the wounded from the Allied armies, along with injured enemy soldiers from Germany, Austria and Bulgaria. The camp consisted of around 50 women. As the doctors performed surgery, other women were driving ambulances, such as fellow Australian Olive King. They maintained motor vehicles and worked as hospital orderlies. At age 36, Mary was initially second in charge under Dr. Agnes Bennett. Mary's salary was £200 per annum, far less than what she would have earned in Australia at that time. While the 200-bed tent hospital was located some kilometres from the battlefront, the dressing station was close to the action. In Mary's first month, she was sent there to relieve Dr. Lillian Cooper. As well as being subject to constant air raids, Mary faced flies and mosquitoes while performing surgery in all weather conditions, including snow. The types of operations were various, including amputations, bomb and bullet wounds. The surgeon's skills were often tested. Surgical fluids often froze in winter, so operations were frequently scheduled for the afternoon, often with the surgeons dressed in fur coats. Mary spoke to her patients in Serbian. Perhaps Mary's time in outback Australia served her well. Perhaps as a testament to her outback ingenuity, Mary used petrol tins to act as braziers to heat the operating theatre. Conceivably, the Australian sense of adventure saw Mary enjoy living in a tent. Mary developed a warm friendship with the writer Miles Franklin, who in mid-17 arrived at the camp to serve as an orderly and cook. Miles recounted that Mary maintained composure under trying circumstances, performing operations at the dressing station at the front while bombs were dropping around them. Their friendship developed over a 6-month period when Mary nursed Miles after she developed lameness in her leg as a result of malaria treatment. Miles wrote in her diary that she was miserable and Mary's kindness was much appreciated. In spite of the many difficulties in camp, both Mary and Miles recounted the cheerfulness that existed. Dress-up parties, special dinners, and trips to the surrounding areas were popular. In September 1917, Dr. Bennett was forced to resign due to malaria. Mary was appointed her successor, now being responsible for some 250 people. She was known as a tireless and energetic worker, which became evident on a winter's night in February 1918, when a severe storm swept through the camp, almost demolishing it. Tents collapsed, medical supplies were scattered and broken. Under Mary's direction, the camp was almost restored within 3 days. In June 1918, Mary's mother died unexpectedly in Guernsey. Unable to attend the funeral, there was little comfort at this time. Mary's war service was recognised by both the Serbian and British governments. She was awarded the Medal of St Sava 3rd Class by the Serbian government. For the rest of her life, however, Mary remained unrecognised by the Australian government for her war service. On her return home, Mary established a successful medical practice in Geelong from 1920 until 1958, when she retired at age 77. She was the city's first female obstetrician, and by 1938 had an outstanding record of 1,000 births without the loss of a single mother. And this was before antibiotics and blood transfusions were mainstream. She was small in stature and modest. At times, the nurses mistook her for the cleaner or a visitor. I met Mary only once when I was a child of 9. A bespectacled woman, I recall her warmth and hospitality, and I especially remember the fondness that my mother spoke of Mary. Mary's modest gravestone reads, "Beloved Auntie Doc," and we honour you today. Thank you.
To conclude this part of the commemoration, after which the program will continue in the adjoining Reg Saunders Gallery for afternoon tea, a book launch and presentation, and a viewing of displays and exhibitions, St Lazarus Serbian Orthodox Church Choir, with conductor Dragomir Milanovic, will perform a folk song composed and sung on the Greek island of Corfu in 1916, a song of longing for home, Tamo Daleko.
Tamo daleko, daleko od mora, tamo je selo moje, tamo je Serbia, tamo je selo moje, tamo je Serbia. Ozar je morala doć, ta tužna nesrećna noć, kada si, Dragane moj, otišao u krvav boj. Kada si, Dragane moj, otišao u krvav boj. Tamo daleko, gde cveta limun žut, tamo je srpskoj vojsci jedini bio put. Tamo je srpskoj vojsci jedini bio put. Otkad te ispratio, za mene sunce ne sja, u Volu prolazi dan i naše ljubavi san. U Volu otadžbine daleko, na Krfu živek ja, ali sam klicao uvek, živela Srbija. Bez otadžbine daleko, na Krfu živek ja, ali sam klicao